I'm David Hatcher Childress, and I'm the owner of Adventures Unlimited and editor of the World Explorers magazine. And recently I've been on this show that's on the History Channel, and it's turned out to be apparently the most popular show on the History Channel. It's called Ancient Aliens. And I know many of you have seen it. We're selling actually some DVDs there. We've just, History Channel ordered another 16 episodes of Ancient Aliens. Yeah. And I think History Channel and myself and others, Eric Van Doniken even, have been pretty pleasantly surprised how popular that show is. And it really shows how people are more and more interested in unusual topics, the unexplained, paranormal, aliens and extraterrestrials, and who we are. I'm the author of a number of books. I started traveling around the world in the 70s, going to China and India, through Afghanistan, through the Middle East, then to Egypt. I traveled around Africa for 2.5 years. Hitchhiked on yachts through the Indian Ocean. I returned to the Middle East and India again, and went to Indonesia, went back to China. On that trip, I was gone for 5.5 years, and finally returned. I left when I was 19. And when I got back, I started writing a series of books called the Lost Cities series. This is one of them, The Lost Cities of Ancient Lemuria in the Pacific. I then did a bunch of books that I edited, including a book called Anti-Gravity and the World Grid. I'm the author of over 25 books, in fact. The popular one that they talk about and have me as the author on the Ancient Alien show is this book, Technology of the Gods. And we're running out of this book because we can hardly keep it in print. It's great. It's about 11 years old now, but it's one of our best-selling books now. A couple of years ago, I came up with this book, too, called The Mystery the Olmecs. After writing this book, I found out that I was one of like 10 experts in the world on the Olmecs. There's so few books on it, and you're going to see some Olmec slides coming up now. So my presentation today is about a bunch of things, but it's basically about megaliths and the world grid, and as we get going, I'll explain more of that. So here we go. I often start my slideshows with this photo. And it's a photo of a statue in Guatemala. And you can see here's a guy standing here. There's people on top of the statue. And this statue has been destroyed. It's not there anymore. And that is kind of what happens to ancient history and to libraries and monuments, is they're destroyed. And we're very much lucky, in a sense, of much of what we have today. Giant ruins, huge pyramids, massive walls of granite. In many cases, they're just piles of giant rocks. This is what you see like at Tiahuanaco and stuff, and then we'll see some pictures of that. But unfortunately, throughout history, there's been this tendency to destroy the past, destroying knowledge, destroying whole libraries of books, such as the Alexandria Library in Egypt, which was destroyed, and actually by fanatical Christians in the 4th century AD. The Emperor Qi Huangdi of China, who built the Great Wall and stuff, he ordered almost all books in China destroyed at the time, about 500 BC. The Spanish, when they got to Central America and they found all the Mayan codex books and stuff, they burned and destroyed them all. There's only 4 Mayan codexes that are known to exist today. So this is part of the problem that archaeologists and historians have, is trying to recreate the past when there's been considerable effort to destroy the past and what we know about it. Oftentimes we talk about Atlantis, and I'm the author of a number of books on Atlantis. In a sense, what Atlantis is the world before our own. The civilization before our world, antediluvian, before the flood. Mainstream scientists, archaeologists, and historians are saying, well, you know, there wasn't a civilization 10,000, 15,000 years ago. You know, just People were cavemen. They weren't building bridges. They weren't building pyramids and ziggurats or port cities. They were in their caves, maybe painting some bison on the wall or something like that. But for those of us, like myself, who believe that civilization is much older than the mainstream is saying, civilization can go back 20,000, 50,000, 100,000 years, or even more. And so we need a name for that. And oftentimes the name would be Atlantis. And Atlantis is, in a sense, the synonym for that world before our own. What you're going to see today is a lot of megaliths and things from around the world. I'm not going to, though, talk that much about Atlantis per se in my presentation today. This is the famous Piri Reis map from 1513. He was a Turkish admiral working for the Ottoman Empire. And what the Piri Reis map did especially was show parts of the world that hadn't been discovered yet, including down here the parts of Antarctica. And in fact, officially, Antarctica wasn't discovered till like 1840 or so. So, I mean, this is a map of Antarctica hundreds of years before it was officially discovered. And even most of South America was not discovered then too. And in fact, the Piri Reis map does an unusual thing too, where it actually shows that Tierra del Fuego and Patagonia, the tip of South America, was linked up to Antarctica. We're the publishers of the book, the main book about this, which is called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. And it was by a professor from New Hampshire named Charles Hapgood. So at the beginning of my program too, I just want to talk about some of the recent things that I've been doing, mainly with my wife Jennifer. And one of the things we did about a year ago, we went on a round the world trip, and we were basing ourselves in an apartment in London of a friend. And we went to the British Museum, which is a super place. And if you've never been to the British Museum, which is in London, and it's free to go to, it's one of the great museums in the world, and there's a lot of interesting things there. And I wanted to talk about this. Our logo is the Easter Island head, so I thought as you walk into the British Museum, there is an Easter Island statue. There are very few statues from Easter Island that are not on the island. There's one in Paris, one in London, and there's like one in Santiago, Chile. But today they won't allow any of the statues to be taken off the island. And we'll see some more of those statues in a little bit. As you first walk into the British Museum, one of the things that's on display right now is one of the famous crystal skulls. And this skull is the companion skull to the famous Mitchell Hedges skull, which you might have read about, that was supposedly found in this Mayan city in Belize. So here's some pictures of the crystal skull. Any crystal object, whether it's a crystal skull or a crystal rabbit or a crystal turtle or something, is an anomalous artifact. Quartz crystal, which is what these are made out of, is extremely hard, extremely difficult to make. And in fact, it's thought by some people that only power tools can carve quartz crystal in this manner. And that's one of the problems that the Smithsonian and the British Museum got into in looking at some of these special crystal skulls, is that they found that power tools had been used in them. And that's where they decided at the Smithsonian and at the British Museum that somehow the Mayans or Aztecs or Zapotecs couldn't have made these skulls, and that is because they were made with power tools, and we would think that the Aztecs or the Mayans didn't have power tools. Although it's possible, of course, and we'll see in a little bit, that they might have. This is high magnification, and this is from the British Museum, of the teeth on the crystal skull, and where it's showing tool marks. What they think now with these crystal skulls, at least, was that they were made in Germany in the 1860s, 1870s, and then they were sold by this guy to the dictator of Mexico at the time, Porfirio Diaz. This guy is a French dealer named Eugene Bourbon. He was in Paris and Mexico, and they're thinking that he's the one who brought these skulls from Germany to Mexico, and then they were later found. The Mitchell-Hedges skull, which is this one, has been here to Kempton. And it was this lady here, Anna Mitchell-Hedges, she's passed away now. She lived to be like 102. And then she brought the skull here. This skull is a companion skull to the one at the British Museum, and it's unusual too because it has a moving jawbone. And of course, when you get around crystal skulls and crystal objects in general, there's an energy that's naturally emitted from them. IBM has done studies with crystals, quartz crystals, and they're thinking now that you can encode any kind of a crystal with lasers, much like a DVD or CD. And in fact, the way we carry memory sticks today around with all of our data and plug it into a computer or something, in theory, a small quartz crystal, just like a pendant you might buy, could hold thousands of gigabytes of information. And that would be a way to store information, and it's a way that the ancients may have stored information too. We're still going through the British Museum, and as you go through, there's a great Egyptian section. Here you have one of the pharaohs meeting Horus. You have also one of the pharaohs, he's meeting with Horus on his right, and there's Osiris, the green man on the left. And as you go through the British Museum too, you'll see lots of exhibits about ancient Babylon and the Sumerians and whatnot. And I thought this was a very interesting metallurgical display with giant chains and axes and things like that. And of course, metals are very important, ancient technology, and we'll get into that in a little bit. I thought this was interesting, how the trident, which is a symbol of Poseidon and Atlantis, the trident, also of the sadhus of India, who are the worshippers of Shiva, and the sadhus, they all carry tridents. And tridents is kind of a symbol of Atlantis, really. And unusual too, this is a very famous plaque at the British Museum. This is a Sumerian demoness or goddess, Lilith, actually. And if you look there, she's got the feet of a bird and stuff like that. And I just show this because it's a really famous kind of a plaque there. And then as you go through, the British Museum is so fantastic, but here's some Sumerian guy from 4000 BC or something like that. And it's kind of what people looked like back then. Walking down the streets of Sumeria or something, he's got his helmet on, nice big beard, and some chainmail, this guy on the street sort of guy. And what was really interesting there at the British Museum, there was a special exhibit, and it was about what are called Jade Cones and Jade discs, Jade discs, like this. And they're carved jade. They're from a civilization called the Langsu people, and they're from around 3000 BC in China, and they were there in southern China, and this is one of the earliest civilizations of China. And in fact, it says right up here, their function and meaning are completely unknown. And making jade discs like the Kongs and the bee, this is a bee. So the emperor himself of China, and the Mayans did this too, and the Olmecs, the symbol that you were the emperor was a jade disc like this. And the emperor would hold it up. I'm the emperor. I would hold up these jade discs. Now, even how they made these and why they were so important is baffling to archaeologists, ones in China and all over the world. And I was so fascinated that the British Museum would have this special exhibition. This is a Kong, okay, C-O-N-G. And they have no idea what these things were for. They are these Jade Towers, and they're hollow, and they're drilled down from both sides. Jade is an extremely hard stone. And for the Chinese and for the Mayans and Olmecs, jade was the most valuable thing. But some of these Kongs are about 2 feet in diameter. They have these special designs on them. And at the British Museum, they were basically saying that these things had to be cut with special tools, like a lathe and things like that. And so they're using like a rotating wheel. They have cutting devices. This is 3000 BC. Now to make these Kongs, which they have no idea what they're for or how they're made, but they say that these were super expensive. Only the emperors and very wealthy could afford to have these jade Kongs, and they have no idea what they could have been for. They just are utterly baffled. But even to make them, they would have had to drill from both sides coming down to make this hollow tube that's inside the Kong. So we're looking at really 5,000-year-old technology drilling through super hard stone, jade, and jade is very rare too. We don't really know where all the jade has come from in the world. There are some jade mines in northern Burma. There's one jade mine in Guatemala. There's types of jade that are found in New Zealand, but even the source of jade is very rare. And so here's other jade objects, what they call adzes or celts that were used. They were also jade tools. The Olmecs used a lot. Here are more of the jade bee. The jade discs. Again, they don't know why they were making these things, what they were for. The emperor would hold them up. I'm the emperor. And this is a Kong down there on the lower left. These are more Kongs, and some Kongs can be just 4 or 5 inches high, or they can be up to 2 or 2.5 feet long. More jade objects there at the British Museum. So I found it really interesting, this whole thing of Kongs. The Kongs and the bee are, in my mind, evidence that, yes, ancient man was using some pretty highly developed tools as long ago as 5,000 years old. Now, what's also depicted on these Kongs is what is called the Couchy Image. And the Couchy Image, when this is on a Shang bronze kettle here, is a kind of a monster face. And it's with these eyes, but it's this very stylized face with swirls and things like that. There's usually 2 eyes down there. This is another Couchy face, also on a bronze. So it's supposed to be this stylized monster, but it's have these very wavy, and the Olmecs and Mayans use things like this, stylized Chinese sort of diagrams. And again, they don't know why this was. And then maybe one of the answers is that because they're using power tools to engrave these things or even make molds or whatever they're doing, that it's this kind of a wavy form is easy to make with on a lathe or a power tool, just to put some design or something into these things. So here's another jade Kong, and if you look down below, it has these rings around it, but then it has the 2 eyes, giving it what's called the Couchy design or face, this monster face that's on these things. Other jade artifacts are there at the British Museum. This one is an Olmec jade face, and here you see the characteristic frown that's on the Olmecs, and I discuss this in a great deal in my Olmec book. He also has the cleft on the top of his head. In my books on Olmecs and the cone heads, we get into this a little bit, and that's very mysterious why some of these guys had this cleft in the middle of their head. And this has something to do with cranial deformation and other things like that. A lot of times, this is another Olmec jade artifact at the British Museum. He's a cone head with elongated head. He's also a dwarf and a hunchback, similar to like the Kokopelli guy of the Southwest who carries a flute around, and he's a hunchback kind of a guy. This is also an Olmec design too at the British Museum. It's a very standard Olmec kind of a figure. He's also a cone head with this elongated head. very oriental looking eyes, and we're going to see some more Olmecs too in just a little bit. This is actually a Mayan jade, also at the British Museum, and he also has the characteristic frown of the Olmecs, which I get into my book as well. And one last Olmec piece, this is a basalt thing that they would wear on their hips. It was part of the ball games, but it's finely designed, basalt, very hard stone to cut and design, and the Olmecs were particularly famous for carving and using basalt, which is extremely difficult to work with as a stone. That jade was so important to the Chinese and to the Mayans and the Olmecs is evident there, where they would use turquoise and jade pieces to make dragons and snakes, or to make these jade masks. And that was something else that both the Chinese and the Olmecs and the Mayans did, was emperors and people like that were given a jade mask on their burial, and their mummy or body, a jade mask was placed on top of it. This is like a Mayan jade mask here. After visiting the British Museum, we then went out into York, where there are these unusual things called the Devil's Arrows. And I've always been fascinated by obelisks. I believe that, we'll get into that in a minute, how obelisks were around the world at one point. And the Devil's Arrows in Yorkshire are 3 giant obelisks that have been like broken off, and then the tops have been scraped down and stuff like that. There were 3 of them. They were much higher at one time. They figure that these things are also from 2000 to 3000 BC. They have no idea who erected them there in England. This is East England, the other side from Stonehenge and whatnot. And here's another one of the Devil's Arrows on the left. They're right near the highway right now of a small town in Yorkshire called Boroughsbridge. And they call them the Devil's Arrows because the people's explanation was that one day the devil decided to throw these giant stones at this town, and he missed the town by just a little bit, but then they stuck in the ground, and they're called the Devil's Arrows. Also, if you just go east of the Devil's Arrows, there is what's called the Stone Monolith. And in fact, they actually built a church around this thing, and the Stone Monolith is here on the right. Here's a modern picture of it. They've made the church. The Stone Monolith is right there. It has, they've put a metal cap on it now. You can see it. It too was like an obelisk, really. A huge, huge standing stone. And so there's a mystery of obelisks, of why they were created, the building and erecting them. Obelisks themselves are megaliths, and they're monoliths too. They're one giant block of granite, typically. This is the Washington Monument here, which is like an obelisk, here being struck by lightning. And that may be one of just mundane theories of obelisks, that they're like giant acupuncture needles or something like that are stuck into the earth. It can bring earth energies, or maybe lightning is to strike them. This is a couple of the obelisks that are at the Karnak Temple in Luxor in southern Egypt. Egypt has probably more obelisks than any other country. There are some in Ethiopia as well. Here's another one of the obelisks at Luxor. In Egyptology, the whole thing of obelisks is also baffling. There's only been maybe 2 books ever written about obelisks there, and they can't explain them either. In Egyptology, obelisks are representing a ray of the sun. That's what they say. And yet, to erect this monument to a ray of the sun, they're moving what may be 100-ton block of granite, cutting it, and then even erecting obelisks is very difficult. Nova did a program on it. It's really the only show that's ever been done about trying to erect obelisks, and they couldn't really do it. And they had Zahiwas and Mark Lerner trying to show how the ancient Egyptians erected obelisks, and they totally failed. And now, then they went to a guy in Massachusetts who had an interesting idea of erecting obelisks. And I mean, just to get it to stand up is hard. And then to keep it standing up, perfectly balanced, this giant needle rock is even harder. And they're still standing in Egypt today after thousands of years. But their idea was to make this giant sand ramp and then slowly remove the sand, and the obelisk eventually, would stand up. And today, for us to erect obelisks and things, we would have to use giant cranes and even build a massive building around the obelisk first just to try and erect it. And in fact, the Romans did exactly that when they started bringing obelisks to Rome. Now, in my book on Atlantis and the power system of the gods, I talked about some of the Edgar Cayce readings and what they called the terrible crystal. The terrible crystal also put out energy. These Atlantean airships called Vimanas or Velixi would draw power from these obelisks that and there would have to be power stations there too, pumping power into the atmosphere for these things. Well, the great inventor Nikola Tesla also had exactly the same idea. And after Tesla invented the AC power that we're using here today, he then proposed the building of these towers. And he called it this world wireless telephone transmitter. Tesla created a whole company for it. He had gone to Colorado Springs to test these towers. These towers were to be like obelisks. A power station would have to be next to it. And then just like a radio antenna or a TV antenna, they'd be pumping power into the atmosphere. And according to Tesla, any kind of airship or electrical device could pick up the power without being plugged in. It's much like what we're using today, wireless transmission. In fact, finally, in the last few years, Silicon Valley is trying to come up with wireless laptops that can be powered, not just get the internet through some cloud, but your laptop can be powered by this power that's in the atmosphere. And that was what Tesla was trying to do back in the 1920s. Strangely, the Russians came up with this whole thing called the Blair Cuspids, and that is that there are obelisks on the moon. And this is what they supposedly look like. They are a known formation on the surface of the moon. They're called the Blair Cuspids. They're named after a British astronomer. His name was Blair. You'd think that NASA and those guys would want to, send one of their Apollo missions or something to these obelisks to have a look. According to them, they haven't done that yet. But this is supposedly, what obelisks are like on the moon. So it seems pretty fantastic, but not only were obelisks around the world at one point, and even probably underwater, or areas that are underwater now, but they were also on the moon. So we're living the whole idea of the moon being some artificial satellite around our planet. The moons of any planet are ideal space bases for exploring a planet. If we were to go to other planets, Mars and stuff like that, it would be ideal to use their moons as space bases. And it may well be that our moon is also some kind of a space base. And I talk about this in my book called Extraterrestrial Archaeology. So after we left England, we then flew to Turkey, and we went to this site called Göbekli Tepe, which is in eastern Turkey. It's near the Syrian and Iraq border. And according to mainstream archaeologists, today, this is the oldest archaeological site in the world. And it's from around 9,500 BC. So it's nearly 11,000 years old. And it's a megalithic site. It's largely these cut stone blocks, which are in the shape of a T. They were maybe used to hold up buildings and other structures. Animals and things like that are carved into some of these the T-shaped megaliths. They are pretty well cut. I mean, somebody has gone through a lot of effort to cut these things and to carve certain animals and things like that, vultures, foxes. Scorpions and things like that are carved into it. Right now, much of the site is still buried. It's kind of on top of a hill. It's being excavated right now. by Turkish archaeologists naturally, but in charge of it is really a German archaeological group from the University of Cologne, and there's a German archaeologist who's in charge. Although their theories on this is that because it's so old, they're actually saying, we had an article in our magazine World Explorer, they're saying, well, yes, they made these megaliths and this was some kind of temple or something, but there really wasn't civilization yet. So yeah, it was kind of which came first, you know, the chicken or the egg? I mean, so you sort of have these megaliths and all these carvings, but no, people weren't really civilized. They weren't living in cities. There weren't, you know, big villages full of craftsmen carving these things out. No, but somebody just kind of came and made this. I mean, and this has to be the first one. But I mean, of course, you know, I would say, and many others, that this is just the tip of the iceberg, really, of ancient sites, of megalithic sites around the world. And in fact, no doubt there's many sites that are even much older than this. There are more pictures of what the site looks like. They're really just beginning to do their excavations there. They're digging things out. You see how they have to protect many of these megaliths. And they've even built buildings and stuff. These are some actual replicas that they put in a park in the nearby town. But you can see how there's lions, what appears to be like cattle and foxes and things like that, boars, other animals are carved in there, and they don't know why. Perhaps, you know, totem kind of things, maybe even astrological signs, but archaeologists are, because of their, it's like a bias they have. Well, you know, whoever made this, they're primitive people, they don't know what they're doing. You know, and we just assume everything from that. And so the sophistication that might be there, I mean, they pass over all that. Well, we went from there to India. This is dancing Shiva. India itself is such an ancient country. When you read all the ancient Indian epics and things like that, they really read like the wildest science fiction. People are running around in airships, blasting each other. They have horrific wars. And mainstream archaeologists call this the Harappan or Indus Valley civilization. Others like myself and people who are believing these ancient civilizations almost often call this the Rama Empire, based on the ancient king Rama. Rama was supposedly from his capital city of Ayodhya. His wife left him, ran off with this other guy down to Sri Lanka. Rama was bummed out for a while and went to the forest to meditate over his wife basically leaving him, and then he decided, hey, I'm going to go back and, you know, get that gal. So he jumps in his Vimana, flies down there, tells her, hey, babe, you're coming home with me. And they have a big fight, but he does bring her home. So that's the story of the Ramayana. And so archaeologists, right after World War II, in Pakistan and parts of Western India, began excavating these cities, and they really hadn't excavated them until that time. Cities like Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Lothal, and they found that they were very sophisticated cities, mainly built out of mud bricks with lots of pools. They were port cities. They were built on rivers. They would have giant ports and things like that. This is what they think some of these cities look like. Lots of canals and stuff. In some ways, sort of like Atlantis, when Atlantis was also to be this canal city with concentric canals and locks and stuff, and you would come in your ships and whatnot. So these are just depictions of how what life was like, supposedly back 3,000-4,000 BC in India. When the archaeologists got to the street level of some of these cities, they found that people were just lying dead in the streets. And some doom had taken over these cities, just like the ancient Indian epics had said. There had been this horrific destruction. And there was no one even left alive to bury the dead. And these people, for thousands of years, just as the desert took over these cities and buried them, and then suddenly in 1948, 1949, 1950, archaeologists discovered this and went, wow, this is strange. They also found lumps of pottery and glass, black lumps that apparently had been ceramics and stuff that had been super melted, like by some amazing heat, like an atomic blast. And we heard John Brandenburg talking about how the evidence that Mars was nuked, in the ancient past. And apparently, even these cities in India might have been nuked as well. And that's what the ancient Indian epics even said. They, of course, had lots of metals and sophisticated metals. And they also carved crystal, too, quartz crystal, like we were talking about, which is extremely difficult to do. And some quartz crystal objects are in the British Museum. They had wheeled toys, and they also had a kind of a script. This is also within the ancient Indian epics. You have these guys with their vimanas here up on the right, which would be some giant flying bird or flying chariot. Eric von Daniken described it, the chariots of the gods that they flew around in. And then you have these masters and yogis who, were all wise and would tell all the stories of the great world of the past and the world before our own that was thousands of years before us, and how it was destroyed, but how advanced they were and enlightened to a point. Although, like us, they had similar problems of warfare and people wanting to destroy each other. And this picture right here is of a yantra. Yantras are also devices. And so when you talk about vimanas and these aircraft, they would talk about a yantra. This kind of a yantra is a meditation yantra that's very common. And in fact, I have a crystal object that I bought in India, which is this carved into a crystal, and it's known as a Sri yantra. And they are representations, in a sense, of machines, and machines that don't exist. I mean, they're just drawings. But a yantra in it is literally translated as like a device. At Mohenjo-Daro, too, they would find these cylinder seals and stamps, like the Chinese also use these seals and things. It has a kind of a script that we haven't deciphered yet. It's a pictographic script that also uses kind of little numbers and impressions in clay. They're often people sort of depicted, stylized. And they're still trying to decipher this script. Here are some pieces of it. This is a script that's 5,000, 6,000 years old. And here's some more pictures of it here. Now, if you also go to Easter Island, one of the most remote islands in the world, and famous for its giant statues, you have what is virtually the identical script. And this is a comparison of the Indus Valley script with the Easter Island script. With the first line there would be the Indus Valley, and then the Easter Island script next to it, which is known as Rongo Island, Rongo script. And in fact, it was written on these tablets. They're called Rongo tablets. The writing was known as a Bostafidan type pattern, which is as the ox plow. So you would write one line, say left to right, and then the next line would go right to left. So it was a continuous line. They haven't figured out what either of these scripts say. But according, again, to mainstream archaeologists, they say, oh, well, the people on Easter Island, they just invented this script themselves about 500 years ago. And here it is, that script again. And yet the same identical script is used like 5,000 years ago in ancient India. So that's the mystery of, and when it gets to writing and things like that, and ancient scripts, ancient languages and all their connections, it's one way that we're able to connect the dots between a lot of ancient civilizations and who they were. And so we'll go now to Easter Island, and we'll look at the world grid. When you go to Easter Island too, you see these giant statues. Many of them are buried up to their chins in this volcanic soil that's around this volcano, which is also the quarry. They call it Arango. You can see these, like the this guy's in the middle, he's buried up to his chin, but there's a good 30 feet of that statue underneath the soil. And how that soil would have built up in just a few hundred years is, I think, very difficult to explain. But according, again, to mainstream archaeologists, just only 100 years or 200 years before the Dutch and Spanish found this island, in the late 1700s, the Easter Islanders had just finished making these statues, yet they're buried up to their chins. The Easter Islanders, too, say that these statues were, because they were moved around the island when they could, but many of them are still around the volcanic quarry, they said that these statues walked, and they walked by themselves. And it's as if these statues were able the people were able to levitate these statues and move them around the island. What the Easter Islanders say about these statues is that they would put eyes in them, and inlaid eyes, and a power came out of the eyes of these statues, which they called mana. And mana is also a Sanskrit word, meaning like a occult power, and like prana, almost like some energy, like orgone energy or something, and it came out of their eyes. And that the purpose of the statues, the Easter Islanders claimed, was to protect the island and keep it from sinking. Because they said that they were originally part of this bigger continent, which they called Hiva, which we might liken to the lost continent of Mu or something like that. And that and Hiva was now under the water, and that Easter Island was the last little tip of this lost continent, and they were using the statues on the island, to keep the rest of this continent from sinking. That was their own explanation. So if you go into the crater, this is the Arango Crater, we're now inside. Here you also have hundreds of these statues that have been carved, and they're also buried up to their chins and noses here, but originally they weren't. Some of them are carved here, and then as we go to the next slide here, this is inside the crater, but all these guys were originally to be moved out of the crater at some point, but never were. And they're still just standing there, they're staring out. But this shows you here where some of the largest statues were cut into this area, and one of them is still right here, in situ. This is one of the largest statues. He was never completely cut out of the rock and then stood up, and then originally they would have moved him to some place around the island. But it's like some catastrophe, some cataclysm just halted all the work on Easter Island, and suddenly it was depopulated, and then the islanders just became sort of marooned on their own island in a sense. So the whole idea of the world grid, some kind of planetary grid system, the whole idea with that is that the planet itself is a dodecahedron, like a giant crystal, with many facets, and energy is moving along facets of this giant crystal, and energy is just naturally moving around the Earth. And it moves in sort of lines of energy, which we might call ley lines, or the Chinese would call them dragon lines. Much of the Chinese art of Feng Shui is about where these dragon lines are and connect, and energy points, where these lines of energy will cross. They'll create like vortex areas and power spots. Oftentimes they use the Great Pyramid as a start for some of these areas. Easter Island is supposedly one of the power spots, and places here, which would be right down here. Many researchers in the world grid have tried to place megaliths and things like that, and ancient sites on these on certain points of the grid system. And actually, as you get into the whole idea of a planetary grid and these vortex areas, the Bermuda Triangle would also be part of it, that you have certain areas where on the planet, and they are geometrically spaced around, And at certain times and in some of these areas, the energy is activated. If you happen to be in a ship or something like that flying, all the instruments in your airplane or your ship go crazy, your compass is spinning wildly, even everything looks different, the sky changes, and in some cases, ships and airplanes just disappear. And they go into some other dimension, or they're sucked down to the bottom of the ocean, or they're sucked up into space or something like that. And that's the whole idea of these vortex areas. Ivan T. Sanderson, who did a lot of this research in the late 60s, called them the vile vortexes. Also, the famous Bermuda Triangle. There's one near Japan called the Devil's Triangle, or the Dragon's Triangle. Easter Island is one of these also vortex areas. And part of the idea is that, if you're in these places at the wrong time, something weird might happen to you. So once again, the whole idea of this world grid being that the Earth is this geometric dodecahedron, and that there are certain places around the world where these lines intersect, these energy lines are traveling. It's sometimes said that this area too, around Kempton and Stell, is a power spot and a vortex area. And part of that too is you can engineer the grid, and that's what's called geomancy. And by using obelisks, standing stones, building pyramids and mounds, you can manipulate the subtle energies that are on the landscape, and particularly around Britain with the ley lines and things like that. It's thought that the early Britons were doing stuff like that, trying to engineer the landscape and work with these energies. And a lot of cathedrals and ancient sites, even like the Rudstone Monument there in York, where they built a church, basically because this giant obelisk was already there. So once again, you're looking at places like Baalbek, Göbekli Tepe, Kalanish stones, Teotihuacan, Easter Island, places, trying to put them at certain sites on the grid and make it significant. And there may be something to that, but I think that in reality, you can build your city and you can put your megaliths and monoliths and whatever you're doing just about anywhere you want, really. But there are certain places that are special, and we'll get into that in a little bit. This is a map coming out of the late 1930s from a group called the Lemurian Fellowship. They claim that the continent of Lemuria was this massive continent that pretty much was outlined by the Pacific tectonic plate and included parts of California and North America, and was centered on Hawaii. And in fact, then there were a couple who lived up near Chicago, Becker and Hoggins, and they put their world grid onto the Lemurian Fellowship map of the Pacific. And then the whole concept of Mu being this continent also in the Pacific. And this was promoted by a British American named James Churchward. He had been a British colonel in India. He claimed that these priests in India had given him certain special information and sent him on a quest around the world, and particularly into the Pacific, in order to find evidence of Mu and the ancients and things like that. So he, starting in the late 1800s, he began traveling into the Pacific and went to Tonga and other areas like that. And he maintained that there was Atlantis in the Atlantic, that there was this lost continent of Mu. He said that South America had been, and there have been all these earth changes, of course, and that there was this Amazonian Sea in the middle, and that there had been a sort of a passage right through the Andes, and the whole thing was lower, and that went from what he thought was the Pacific into into the Amazon Sea and into the Atlantic. This is James Churchward, what he looked like. He was a pretty cool guy, and in fact, he was a millionaire. He was really the inventor of stainless steel, as we know it today. And in fact, he then sold the patent of stainless steel. This was right after World War I, sorry. And he sold it to the Bethlehem Steel Corporation, and that's what made him this millionaire. And he used that money to then self-publish his own books on the lost continent of Mu and then the children of Mu and things like that. Churchward also believed in this idea of a pole shift, that the Earth would be a crustal displacement, and the Earth would move on the core, and what would be right at the North Pole would move some degrees down. This would have caused massive cataclysms, tidal waves would wash over continents. He believed that this was what caused a lot of the mass extinctions as well, was the shifting of the Earth around. It would later, Charles Hapgood, who wrote Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings and a book called Path of the Pole, he expanded on all this, that the North Pole and the South Pole and other things like that weren't always where they were, and that occasionally, because of massive amounts of ice and stuff like that building up, that the Earth would eventually kind of flip in space, kind of a thing. And this is one of his drawings. This is what Churchward also thought that Mu looked like at the time. He would draw his maps and stuff like that. And he claimed that, he was getting information from these secret libraries in India, whatnot. So some of his maps, again, on Atlantis, he felt that from Mu, people were moving out and migrating to all different areas of the planet and whatnot, and going through these ancient canals. This is all before cataclysmic changes created really the world of today. But he maintained that, these civilizations were from 20,000 years ago at least, even more. And of course, they were building megaliths and port cities and putting kind of things up all over the world. But because of these cataclysmic changes, civilization gets wiped out periodically. There would be these giant tidal waves that would roar across continents, basically, sending the whole parts of the Earth underwater, and new parts of the Earth would rise up and stuff like that. Churchward even had his own alphabet that he was working on with Mu and the Mayan, and he took a lot of this from a French archaeologist named Augustus Lepongion. Lepongion was like a super Masonic guy who went, and he's the first one to do a lot of the excavations at Chichen Itza in the Yucatan. And he believed too that the Egyptians and the Mayans, and he apparently was a believer in this lost continent of Mu as well with Churchward, and he knew Churchward. So Churchward used some of his decipherment of Mayan hieroglyphs and stuff, and used his own ideas of Mu. In the 1960s, they republished a bunch of Churchward's books as paperbacks, and then they were popular just before Eric von Daniken's books on Chariots of the Gods and stuff. People were reading that. And his second book was The Children of Mu, and he basically maintained, we're all the children of Mu, and really Atlantis and all the civilizations were ultimately derived from Mu in his mind. So the idea too of different continents, some underwater, some above water, it started to develop in the late 1800s, and that's before what is today modern tectonic plate theory. But it was from these early things that Lemuria was created. Lemuria is really named after these kind of squirrel monkey type animals called lemurs. And they exist in Madagascar, but they also exist in Malaysia and Indonesia and stuff. So early geologists thought, there must have been this continent that expanded really in the Indian Ocean. They called it Lemuria. But later, people like Madame Blavatsky of the Theosophical Society, they turned Lemuria into more of a Pacific continent, like James Church would Mu. And in many cases now, Lemuria and Mu are kind of much the same. The Theosophical Society was trying also to create their own maps of what the world looked like back then, and their maps don't make much sense. There's sort of psychic maps of various land areas that were somehow above water. But it was really when tectonic plate theory was formulated that people really got the ideas of how there are these special plates, continental plates, and how they move around. And it's those plates that are crashing into each other or even pulling apart, that are creating much of the earth changes, the tsunamis that we're getting. And the biggest earthquakes tend to happen at where these tectonic plates are going. But then that also came, that there were problems with all that. And the idea that these plates can just slide all over the planet. In tectonic plate, they can't. And with continental drift theory, yeah, the idea, that some continent's going to just drift, and collide eventually into some other continent. But everywhere there's a continent, whether it's above the water or below it, there's still a tectonic plate there. And really a tectonic plate can't go very far without crashing into another one. But the only theory that allows for that kind of ocean spreading, as they call it, is what's called the expanding Earth theory, and that the Earth has been expanding. And that allows the continents to fit together pretty well, and because the Earth is expanding and getting larger, there is this ocean spreading, and the continents pull apart, and then you have new land area spreading in, which would, in many cases, be under the ocean. And so it's really only expanding Earth theory that can really explain all that. And you'll find now that expanding Earth theory, which was poo-pooed for a long time by geologists, is now becoming popular again. And there's a number of Australian geologists who are promoting, once again, the idea of the expanding Earth. And it does make a lot of sense. Another interesting map of the world in prehistory is the Owaspie map from 1882. And it was done by a Chicago dentist. And named Dr. Newborough, and he would go into a trance and he dictated the Owaspie book. And in the Owaspie book are some pretty interesting maps. And Owaspie, according to him, and the entities he was channeling, that is the name of our planet, is Owaspie, they said. And it too included what was a pretty interesting map of the Pacific, of a kind of a Mu and Lemuria. And in fact, if anything, the map from the Owaspie is very similar to the Lemurian Fellowship's map of the Pacific, although it doesn't really totally include California and other parts of North America. And here is that Lemurian Fellowship map, again, with the Owaspie map. And they maintained there were all these valleys here. Easter Island would be down here. But yeah, they were saying that California is all part of it. And that would also put places like Mount Shasta and other areas as part of this Lemurian continent, supposedly. Now, the Rosicrucians in San Jose, AMORC, it's often called, they came out with a book, too, about Lemurian Mount Shasta. And it, too, was a kind of an expanding Earth sort of theory, where somehow Lemuria was pulled away from the continent, and the continents also were together, and then they split apart. That would also have to be some kind of expanding Earth type of a theory. So back again to churchward stuff about South America and the Amazon, there being an Amazon Sea. This would have been South America well over 10,000 years ago. And then they believe too that there's some kind of a canal that was actually made, like the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal or something like that. This is very much in ancient times, trying to facilitate ocean travel and stuff like that, like 15,000 BC or something. Okay, so back again to Easter Island briefly. one of the points on the world grid. And on Easter Island are some very interesting megalithic walls. This one's called Vinapu. It too is perfectly fitted granite blocks, huge lichen patches on there as well. The granite blocks are cut in such a way and articulated with little corners and a jigsaw pattern, and they're perfectly fitted, which is exactly like the walls that you see in Peru and Bolivia and other areas of the world. Perfectly fitted blocks. I mean, you cannot get a razor blade between these things. And whoever the stonemasons are who are working this are, I mean, they're not only excellent stonemasons, but they're wanting to do things in a perfect way. I mean, just big blocks sort of fitting together is not good enough for them. It has to be just done to incredible precision. The most sacred thing on Easter Island is this round ball. It's a granite ball. On Easter Island, they say this is the most important thing on the island. It's, it's about, it's like 2.5 feet, sort of round, and it's not perfectly round. And it's in a part of the island that's not where the statues are. It's kind of out by itself. They've built like a wall around it. And Easter Islanders can't really explain why this is so important. I mean, to them, this round ball is just super duper important. And the masterminds who built the statues and came to the island, this is somehow, the most important thing they had. But why? And archaeologists are baffled too. Why would this stone ball be so important? Well, as I started looking at all this stuff, and I made a trip to Costa Rica a couple of years ago, we went and found in Costa Rica all these giant stone balls. And I found that these weird granite balls, some of them perfectly round and huge, are also all over the world, and particularly there in this one area of the Pacific coast of Costa Rica. And some of these balls are huge. I mean, they're all the size of a car. They're much bigger than the one that's in Easter Island. And some are different sizes, just a few feet around. Others are like 5-6 feet square. In many cases, they're perfectly round, perfectly. And once again, archaeologists, they have no explanation. They have no idea why people would create these round balls, how they did it. And in fact, it's been said that trying to create a perfectly round stone ball is one of the most difficult things to do. And just to bash it out with a rock in your hand is like virtually impossible. Here, most of the round balls are found in this area, near to Panama, the very southwest part of Costa Rica. And in fact, there's a little island right over here that's not on this map, and it also has some of these round balls on it. And they're found up in the jungles, just up in these hills along the Pacific coast. And it's as if some giant tidal wave, a cataclysm, just washed these stone balls, and they know they're man-made, up into these jungle mountains of Costa Rica. Well, as I began researching these round balls and stuff, one of our readers of World Explorer magazine sent me this old book about the building of the trolley in Santa Monica. And so this is part of Los Angeles, and this was around at the same time they were building the trolley cars in San Francisco and stuff like that. And so these trolley cars in Santa Monica and LA, they're electric, and they can't go up a very steep grade. It has to be relatively level for them. So they had to send out these big steam shovels to cut through some of the hills and stuff like that around Los Angeles so that the trolley cars wouldn't have to go up these hills. And when they did that, in this one hill, they found all these round stone balls. So now at the time, we don't know what happened to these things. They're not in any museum in Los Angeles. What they said was, at the time, they said, well, they're dinosaur eggs. Yeah. So that's the story of those round balls. Yeah, so suddenly, yeah, they're excavating. They find these stone balls. And, I mean, and there was dozens of them, and they were huge. And, of course, they don't know why or what they're for. And, in fact, there's a place in China, Hubei, China, where they're also found in Malta. And this is Malta right here, where also a bunch of stone balls are found in Malta. They don't know what they're for. Perhaps to move megaliths around. That's one theory. These balls are very well worn, so they're not perfectly round anymore. And then these are these balls at this town in Hubei, China, this little village. And it also has a bunch of these round balls in it. And they don't know why, what they're for, how they got there, who built them. And it's just totally baffling, the whole round ball kind of thing. And even on Easter Island is also this small round ball which is in the museum. But the bigger round ball is outside, and they just leave it outside. I mentioned too at Easter Island how the statues originally, they claimed, had these inlaid eyes, and this power came out of the eyes, they claimed, and was to protect the island. We'll look again at a few more slides of Easter Island. Here's the famous Norwegian archaeologist Thor Heyerdahl. You can see how big some of these statues are, how they're buried in 30 to 40 feet of soil. And the islanders didn't do this. They didn't go out and bury these things. I mean, they must have just been standing there, and probably for thousands of years, and then to get completely buried like this. Also on Easter Island is this unusual statue. And it's the only one that's on Easter Island, and the person is kneeling. And this is a special way of configuring a statue, and it's known as the Kwazulu Position. And the Kwazulu Position is where someone is on their knees and then typically has their hands on their thighs, and they're often looking down. It's a special kind of a position, and it's called Kwazulu. It's a kind of a sublimation to someone, to a king or something like that. And what's strange about Kwazulu is that you find this position all over the world, including at Tiahuanaco. And this is a statue from Tiahuanaco in Bolivia of Kwazulu. So this is also one of the statues from Tiahuanaco. You don't see this at Tiahuanaco now. They've moved it. But he's wearing a turban. But this is the Kwazulu position. You're on your knees with your hands on your knees. You found that in Egypt. You have the Kwazulu position. At the Indus Valley in Harappa in India, also they use the Kwazulu position. Again, another Egyptian statue in a quasi-Kwazulu position because he's got one hand up over his chest. That is also known as the tiki position, where you put your hands in certain ways. Here is a Shang Chinese statue in the Kwazulu position. He's got his hands on his knees. This is ancient Chinese, so this is about 3000 BC. This is also a Shang Chinese statue in the Kwazulu position. And notice here his haircut. He's got this like mohawk kind of a haircut that's unusual. Here's an Olmec statue. He's also in a Kwazulu position there. Here's another Shang Chinese statue, also in the Kwazulu position. This is an Olmec statue. He's also in a Kwazulu type position. His hands are up by his chest. Notice that he also has this strange mohawk kind of haircut, which we were just seeing in ancient Shang China. So the whole thing of the Olmecs, before the Mayans, the civilization that was in Mexico was the Olmecs. And they're one of the most mysterious civilizations in the world. They weren't really discovered until just prior to World War II. It was in the late 1930s that archaeologists began to realize that there was this culture that was pre-Mayan. And they called them the Olmecs after the rubber people. And it was the kind of art and the facial features of the people that made them realize that these weren't the Mayans and that they were pre-Mayan. This is what Olmecs looked like. They were cone heads. They typically had the extended cranium. They often had very oriental features, but also very African features too. One of the most distinctive things about the Olmecs is what they call the Colossal Heads, and they're carved out of basalt, 20-ton basalt boulders. Basalt, again, is extremely hard to carve. These heads were just in these swamps in western Mexico along the Gulf Coast, and this is around the Tabasco region and a place like Villahermosa, and also up the coast there, Veracruz. They believe that the Olmec capital was an area called La Venta. Many of these giant colossal heads, as they call them, weighing 20 tons, they were buried. It's as if somebody had purposely tried to destroy these heads. They literally had to dig them out of these swamps and things. There's around 20 or so of the giant, colossal basalt heads. So the area of the Olmecs is actually on both of the coasts. La Venta and the colossal heads are in this area of the Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic, but this area down here, what they call the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, this is also an Olmec area. And areas even like Monte Alban and even Teotihuacan, Chalcatzingo, that's also a known Olmec area, and even Olmec areas went along this side of the Pacific coast, and down into Central America too, down into El Salvador, and even really as far as Costa Rica and Panama at least. And so the Olmecs were really on both ocean coasts. They were in the Pacific and they were in the Atlantic. This is the main area of the Olmecs on the Atlantic side, areas like Tuxtla, Tres Zapotes, and their Olmec mask and things like that. And I go into much greater detail, of course, about all this in my book, The Mystery of the Olmecs. So now most of these colossal heads are now in museums in Mexico, some in Mexico City, some in Jalapa, Mexico, which is near Veracruz. So they've erected these. And one of the things that you see, particularly about the colossal basalt heads, is they look very African. And it's quite clear, in a way, that, yeah, these guys aren't really your typical, Native American types, which you kind of think of with, say, Mayans, but they seem, in fact, to be from Africa, from Egypt, say. But other Olmecs have other features, too. So here's some of the colossal heads that are now in the museum. They're weighing like 20 tons. This guy is also an Olmec. He's in the Kwazulu Position. He's wearing special headdress and whatnot. This is another Olmec statue. He's also in a Kwazulu Position. Notice how he has the top knot up here, like the way he's wearing his head, his hair. And this is the way also sadhus in India tie their hair today. This is also with the Easter Island statues and Vikings, where you have really long hair and you tie it then in a big bun on top of your head. More of the colossal basalt heads. They're all wearing these kind of interesting turbans or helmets and things like that on them. It's known now that the Olmecs go back to about 3000 BC. That's the date that mainstream archaeologists give them. This is also an Olmec statue. Some of them are very stylized. This is an Olmec statue too. He has what's known as the V cleft on the top of his head. They don't know what this is about or why that is. This is another Olmec boulder statue, looking very Egyptian, in fact. And he apparently has the false beard that many of the Egyptian pharaohs wore. And then we get into guys like this. He's an Olmec too, only he's now looking very Chinese. These guys are Olmecs. They're at the museums and stuff. And in fact, some of these guys, particularly the Chinese-looking Olmecs, are in these smiling, ecstatic kind of positions and facial expressions. And it's thought in some cases that one of the things that's going on with them, which is a big Chinese and Olmec thing, is using hallucinogenic mushrooms. And that these guys, and that was something they did. And many of the Olmec burials would have jade artifacts and also dried hallucinogenic mushrooms and stuff. This is also another famous Olmec statue holding a baby. He's also looking very Oriental and Chinese. Here we go, one of these ecstatic Olmec statues, also looking extremely Chinese. But this guy's an Olmec too, and he looks very Mediterranean, like some Phoenician guy. He's got a full mustache and beard. American Indians don't have facial hair. They don't have to shave, and Mayans didn't have to either. He's known as either the wrestler or the rower, like as some seafarer. And so as you look at all these Olmec guys, they're much like Americans. They're coming from all over the world, from every continent. They're every racial type. But of course, to mainstream archaeologists, oh no, they're all American Indians. That's what because they can't be from other continents. And even these guys, he's just some American Indian who walked from Siberia down through Canada and then down to Mexico. I mean, that's what they say. If you go to Harvard or University of Illinois, he might look kind of African, but he's not. He's American Indian. That's what they say. Again, it was exciting. I mean, it's Indiana Jones kind of stuff where they're finding these giant heads in the jungles and swamps. And this is the area of oil exploration in Mexico. So they literally find these things with bulldozers and stuff. The cities like Levanta had very sophisticated drainage systems and things like that, which is what you need. And in my book, Technology of the Gods, my first chapter is all about sewage and water systems and cleanliness. You can't really have civilization without having good water supply, good sewage, that kind of a thing. This guy's also an Olmec. He's wearing a hat. He's sitting in the lap of some dragon and serpent, and he's holding this strange satchel right here. This satchel thing is, and they don't know what that is. And that's something also that the Babylonians and Sumerians would hold. And that's just still a mystery to archaeologists. Like, what is in this little satchel and bag that they hold? And it's barely something important. They can't figure it out. These guys are all Olmecs. Some of them are jade. This is what they look like. Again, they're cone heads. They have the cranial deformation. These guys are Olmecs too. Also some of them very bearded, with the mustaches over here, like those guys. This was an important Olmec celt. This is also made out of jade. This is today in the museum in Mexico City. They brought a specialist from China, a Shang Chinese specialist in the early Chinese writing. And there are some inscriptions on the back of these things, and he identified them as early Shang Chinese glyphs. So according to him, a Chinese expert, he was basically saying that, yeah, this early Olmec writing is coming from China. This is also, this today in the Smithsonian Museum. This is what's known as the Tuxtla statue. He's a guy with a kind of a duckbill face, almost like a platypus. And these early glyphs are on this statue. These are proto-Mayan. They're before Mayan hieroglyphs. And just today, they're just starting to figure out and decipher the Mayan hieroglyphs. But the Olmec writing is even earlier, and that's something they haven't been able to decipher yet. And in fact, they're still deciphering Mayan at this point too. Yes, the Olmecs, they had bronze. They had iron utensils. This has been actually, this is controversial because a lot of the mainstream archaeologists have said, oh, but you know, they made those giant basalt heads and stuff, but they didn't have metal tools. But we know that they did, and in fact they found tons of iron slag at Leventa. So the whole idea that these guys didn't have metal tools, hard metal tools and stuff is false. One of the strange things now too is Teotihuacan. These are the giant pyramids just outside Mexico City. And they were built, they think now, starting anywhere from around 1000 BC up to about 200 AD. They haven't been able to really pin down the dates of this. And Mexican archaeologists, they don't know who built Teotihuacan. They don't know. The Aztecs didn't build Teotihuacan, they say. The Toltecs didn't build Teotihuacan. The Mayans didn't build Teotihuacan. And it's a mystery who it was. But in fact, it was probably the Olmecs who built it. But one of the strange things about Teotihuacan, and in fact this will be in one of the Ancient Aliens episodes coming up, is that they found layers of mica built into the pyramids at Teotihuacan. Sometimes mica up to 12 inches thick. And then later, just recently, they found chambers inside Teotihuacan also with all this mica in it. Now, it was just starting around 1900 that Mexican archaeologists began the excavations at Teotihuacan. And this is some of the mica right up here. And in fact, that Mexican archaeologist, he sold most of the mica that was early excavated out of Teotihuacan, and you don't see it when you go there today. But they know that it was there. But one of the really strange things was that the archaeologists wanted to find out where this mica was from. And as they did that, what they discovered was that this mica in Teotihuacan had come from Brazil. So now these mystery builders of the pyramids in Mexico had gone all the way to another continent, to Brazil, apparently by boat or airships or whatever, and brought back what was tons of mica to put into the pyramids at Teotihuacan. Now, why would they do that? And on top of that, mainstream archaeologists would say that was impossible because ancient Mexico had no contact with Brazil or South America, that's what they say. And yet other archaeologists are saying, well, yeah, maybe they didn't have any contact with those guys, but they went there and brought tons of mica back, and it was somehow so important to them that they had to make these extraordinary trips, you know, to get this mica. I mean, and it had to come from, they couldn't find mica there in Mexico, so they went to South America to get it. Now you have to ask yourself too, why? I mean, what's the purpose even? Well, with layers of mica built into these pyramids, mica is used today in all kinds of electronics and capacitors and things like that. And mica has unique abilities. And apparently, I mean, one of the ideas here is by building this pyramid with thick layers of mica throughout it, it would be literally charged like a battery, and just the sun's rays and cosmic rays hitting the pyramid would help charge this pyramid. And then if you had water also running underneath the pyramid, which Teotihuacan had at that time, what you have is like a self-charging battery, a perpetually self-charging battery that's putting out like a subtle energy, and would almost be like a self-charging space beacon or something like that. And if you had the kind of instruments, say in a spaceship or something like that, you could use these pyramids and the energy coming out of them as like a permanent type of a space beacon that would help you navigate. And in many ways would be also, like the world grid. And of course, this pyramid itself would naturally be some point on the world grid. And if it was being geomanced, then I mean, they're actually just creating a power point on the world grid. Also at Teotihuacan is a lot of obsidian. And a lot of ancient sites too were near obsidian mines. And obsidian was extremely important. And many Pacific islands too are because of the obsidian. This is what Teotihuacan would have looked like back then, a couple thousand years ago. It was also some kind of pyramid city with water flowing through it, many man-made lakes and things like that. All right, so now we are going to go to South America. This is Tiahuanaco, the Great Gate of the Sun there. The Gate of the Sun itself is a giant monolithic piece of granite, all carved. It's been split by an earthquake. And in fact, somebody in ancient times moved this thing where it is today. This is the backside. And this gate was never meant to be standing by itself. And it's over here on the side, on this area over here. You see how it's coming down, it's notched. Some other giant block is going to be fitted into that. At Teotihuacan too is this hydraulic works, water works that were channeled all throughout the city. They diverted a nearby river. They were able to apparently wash ores. And it would seem that Tiahuanaco itself is some kind of was a gigantic, like, metallurgical plant for washing ores, creating bronze and things like that. These are the keystone cuts and clamps that would go into these giant blocks that we kind of see. These are also what are called keystone cuts. You see over here what would be the clamps there, here, like this, and then the clamps, metals are poured into these clamps right here, and it's a way of holding these blocks together. We were just there some months ago with the World Explorers Club, and Christopher Dunn went with us on this trip too. And we found out something really interesting from our guide, and that was that there's this giant pyramid near Tiahuanaco, and you can see it from Tiahuanaco. It's out to the west. And I mean, I had seen it before, but it was so big that it looks like a mountain. And even today, it's not acknowledged as actually a pyramid. But we discovered that it was a pyramid because our guide said, oh yeah, the natives and the locals who live in this town down there, they're excavating this pyramid here, and they're digging into the side of it, and they're removing all these statues and other artifacts, ancient Tiahuanaco kind of stuff. And we told our guide, oh man, let's go to that town, let's go to that pyramid. And he reluctantly said, okay, well, we'll let the bus go part of the way. But as we got to the edge of this village, he said, oh, we can't go any farther, because if we go into this village, the villagers won't like it. I mean, they'll be mad. He was afraid to actually go into the village, because basically the villagers are looting this giant pyramid. And they didn't want anybody, including the government or anybody, to go in there. And a bunch of foreign tourists in a bus, were not going to be welcome in this village, really. What apparently came out of this pyramid and other sites around Tiahuanaco are two things which are now in a new museum in La Paz. And it's called the La Fuente dish. And it's this dish right now that's ceramic. And what's in this dish is writing. And in fact, a kind of Sumerian cuneiform writing here, and these other glyphs on this side. And now what they're saying is, here we go, some of the glyphs. And there's a statue that's also found there at Tiahuanaco. And this is all pretty new, and it's in the new issue of our magazine, World Explorer, that, yes, at Tiahuanaco, they're finding artifacts with Sumerian writing on them. And in fact, it's been pointed out too that the term Inca is a Sumerian word and means great lord. And they're thinking now, in fact, here's some of the Sumerian, a little bit hard to see. And this Patokia monolith, this is also a statue, a granite statue. It's also in the same museum. It also has some Sumerian writing on it. And these are in museums, in a museum in La Paz. So mainstream archaeologists are, of course, this is a bomb for them. I mean, this is not something they could ever admit. And the idea that at Tiahuanaco there's Sumerian writing, and this is something that I believe, will ultimately be conclusively proven, because this is Sumerian. And what would normally happen in a case like this, with the archaeologists, when they get their back up against the wall, they have to declare hoax. And I mean, that would be the only thing they can do, is say, oh, this is just a big hoax. Okay, and like the Kensington Rune Stone, other writings that are found in out-of-place areas, I mean, if they're not authentic, then they're a hoax. And this is a problem for them. But they're thinking now that this is also part from the Couchy Monolith. This is kind of a writing. Here's some of the sign list, that's the inscriptions that are on that. By the way, supposedly in South America, there's absolutely no writing. And there's writing in Mexico and stuff like that, the Mayans and the Olmecs, but in South America, there's not supposed to be any writing. And the Incas allegedly also did not use any kind of writing, but they used these knotted ropes and stuff like that. They're thinking now that Aymara, the language that is spoken around the southern part of Lake Titicaca, is Sumerian. And Sumerian itself, here's a Sumerian tablet. Sumerian is a unique language. Allegedly, no other language is related to Sumerian. It has, that's what they're saying, language experts. Most languages are related somehow, but not Sumerian, they say. But now they're thinking that there is one language that is related to Sumerian, and it's Aymara, the language that's spoken around the southern part of Lake Titicaca. Other parts of Peru don't speak Aymara. They speak Quechua, which was the language of the Wari. This is what that bowl looks like here, and then the writing parts are over here, and here's what the Sumerian cuneiform writing is. These guys are from Tiahuanaco too. They look like Olmecs, they look Chinese, they are bearded, Phoenician kind of guys. These are your cone heads of Peru. They're found around Nazca and Ica, also at Tiahuanaco and other areas. The Olmecs too look like this. This is what many of these guys look like. They had these elongated heads, very, very strange looking people. In Peru particularly, they have found hundreds, thousands of these. Along the coastal desert of Peru, it is so dry that mummies and skeletal remains are very, very well preserved. Other guys have these pumpkin head kind of features. This is a kind of cranial deformation. We do know that, I mean, ancient people were able to do this. You do this to little babies before their heads have fused and stuff together, and they do this. But you get this strange either cone head or a widening effect. We don't know why ancient people did this. In some ways, it doubled their cranial capacity. Akhenaten and Nefertiti, they were cone heads too. These are their daughters, Meritaten and Meketaten. Tutankhamun, he was also a cone head. This is Meritaten. This is what they look like. They were the Kurds and the Hittites also did this. Chinese also did this. This is a statue of Tutankhamun from his tomb. You don't really, whenever you see stuff about Tutankhamun, they're x-raying his mummy and all that. Yeah, they never mention that he's a cone head, but he is. This is also a statue from his tomb of Tutankhamun. This is what he looked like, as depicted by Egyptian, artisans and stuff like that. This still went on right up until after World War II. In islands in like Vanuatu and stuff, they were doing that. This is from the Congo. I mean, this is from the 1920s right here. The Kurds in northern Iraq were also still doing cranial deformation right up until 1960s, actually. When you go to Tiahuanaco at Pumapunku, you see these giant blocks of granite. They're just thrown around like some kids' toy blocks. You see, again, the keystone cuts where these clamps would go into it. You see here also how the keystone cuts would have been. They would pour molten metals into this in order to hold these blocks together. And it's an unusual way of putting giant blocks together, but they used that in ancient Egypt and other places all over the world. This is from Karnak Temple in Luxor, and they're doing the same thing, cutting these special keystone clamps on two blocks and then pouring molten metals into it. One of the ancient world grid sites is a spot right over here, number 28 on this thing. It's north of New Guinea. And it is this place called, it's an island called Pohnpei. On this island is a city called Nan Madol, sometimes called Medalanum. It is one of the 8 wonders of the world. It's actually built into the island. This is a place where hurricanes, cyclones start at this island. It's a kind of, like a vortex grid area. The city itself is 100 artificial islands built into the ocean. And there's over 150 million tons of basalt that's been dismantled and then stacked up into artificial islands and walls 40 feet high. And most of it's not even on the island. It's literally in the ocean. There's so much material that's used at Nan Madol that entire mountains would be dismantled to give them the material to do it. And they don't know where those mountains are. They've been literally dismantled. But much of it's in the ocean. It's underwater. This is Nan Madol over here. So it's a city right here. The natives themselves don't like going to this island. They're afraid to spend the night there. There's all kinds of also magnetic anomalies. Lights move around in the city. The city itself is highly magnetic. It's one of the strangest places in the world. It's remote to go to. The natives say that the stones, the 150 million tons of stone that's used in this island, that it was magically flown through the air and put into place. That's what they say. And so I'll just end once again with one of Churchward's maps, and thank you very much.